The rain in Budapest never truly stopped. It shifted from downpour to drizzle, from drizzle to a cold mist that clung to everything like a second skin, but it never stopped. Tonight it was somewhere between fury and resignation, hammering the cobblestones of a narrow alley behind a centuries-old cathedral with the kind of relentless violence that seemed almost personal. The kind of night where the city itself was angry about something, though no one living could say what. Eric Brooks' Blade had seen worse weather. He had seen worse cities. What he had not seen, in all his decades of hunting the undead across a dozen countries and through more blood-soaked doorways than any man alive could survive, was this particular configuration of wrongness. It started with the smell. Vampire. Thick, ancient, saturated into the stonework, and the very air like centuries of rot compressed into something almost elegant. But underneath it, underneath the familiar stench of dead flesh wearing a living mask, there was something else, something older, a second predator's scent, musk and iron and wild earth, layered into the same space as if both species had been breathing the same air for a very long time. He had arrived 45 minutes ago, though arrived was generous for what had actually happened. The last thing he remembered clearly was the coven in Prague, 7 of them, gathered in a sub-basement ritual chamber beneath a decommissioned factory, performing something he had initially dismissed as another resurrection attempt. He had been wrong. The symbols they carved into the floor pulsed with a light that was not quite light, more like the absence of light given form and intent. When he had cut through the first 3 and the ritual circle shattered, the world had folded. Not broken, folded. Like a page in a book being turned by an indifferent hand, and he had fallen through the crease and landed here, in this rain-soaked alley, with the taste of dimensional wrongness still burning in the back of his throat and his internal compass spinning uselessly. But Blade did not waste time on confusion. Confusion was a luxury afforded to people who had the option of sitting down and processing. He had spent his entire existence as something the world did not have a category for, born from a vampire's bite, carrying their strength while rejecting everything else they were, and that existence had taught him one lesson above all others: orient, assess, act. The environment first, then the threats, then the mission. The environment told him this city was old, European, wealthy in a way that spoke of centuries of accumulated power rather than modern industry. The architecture was Gothic, heavy, built to last millennia. The streets were wet and empty in a way that felt curated rather than natural, as though someone had ensured no one would be walking this particular stretch of alley tonight. And the vampires, he could feel them, not 1 or 2 dozen, spread across the surrounding blocks in a pattern that was too organized, too deliberate to be coincidental. A perimeter. Someone knew he was here. If you want to see more characters crash into universes they were never meant to enter, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. Hope shines brightest in the darkest night. The first attack came from above. 3 of them dropped from the cathedral's roof in perfect synchronization: black leather, tactical gear, automatic weapons modified with UV burst magazines. Death dealers, though Blade did not know the name yet. What he knew immediately was that these were not the sloppy, disorganized covens he had been hunting for the last decade. These moved like soldiers, trained, disciplined. They opened fire before they landed, the UV rounds screaming through the rain in bright arcs that would have incinerated a standard vampire on contact. The fact that they were using them on him meant someone had already identified what he was, or at least suspected. Blade moved, not quickly by human standards, impossibly quickly. He closed the distance to the nearest shooter in less than a heartbeat, the katana clearing its sheath in a single fluid motion that turned the vampire's torso into 2 separate problems. The body dissolved before it hit the ground, not dusting like the lesser vampires he was accustomed to, but liquefying, the ancient blood within breaking down and spreading across the cobblestones in a dark mirror that reflected the rain. Different. Older blood, stronger. The second and third attackers adjusted instantly, no hesitation, no shock at watching their companion die. They shifted formation, one laying suppressive fire while the other closed to melee range with a short sword that hummed with some kind of embedded technology. Blade deflected the blade, heavier than it looked, magnetized, designed to stick to metal, and drove his elbow into the vampire's throat hard enough to cave in the trachea. It would not kill him. Nothing short of decapitation or a UV grenade seemed to kill these particular vampires permanently. But it bought 3 seconds, and 3 seconds was an eternity. He used them to end the third attacker with a silver round through the cranium from his sidearm, a modified Beretta that had been his companion through more hunts than he could count. The bullet worked. The vampire's skull caved inward and the body went rigid, then collapsed. Dead, truly dead. Silver, then. At least that universal law had survived whatever dimensional breach had deposited him here. The alley fell silent except for the rain. Blade stood among the dissolving remains, breathing evenly, his senses extended to their maximum radius. The perimeter he had felt earlier was still there, but it was tightening, drawing closer, responding to the failure of the first wave. He checked his magazine. 14 rounds remaining. He had perhaps 2 minutes before whatever commanded those soldiers sent something larger. He did not run. Running, in Blade's experience, was almost always the wrong choice when facing an enemy that could see in the dark, move faster than humans, and had spent centuries perfecting the art of pursuit. Instead, he moved laterally, out of the kill zone and toward higher ground, the cathedral's entrance a massive oak door that swung open under his shoulder with surprising ease. Inside, the nave was dark and cold and impossibly vast, the vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadow far above. Stained glass windows filtered the city's ambient light into colored fragments that painted the stone floor in muted blues and reds. And there, standing at the far end of the nave beside the altar, was a woman. She was watching him with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite satisfaction, something between the two, something calculating. She spoke first, and her accent carried the weight of centuries. "A Daywalker," she said. "I thought your kind was extinct." Her name was Selene, and she had been watching him for longer than the 45 minutes Blade had known he existed in this city. She did not move from her position beside the altar as he entered the nave fully, the cathedral doors swinging shut behind him with a resonance that vibrated through the ancient stone. The rain sounds vanished completely, sealed out by walls that had been built to contain something far older than worship. Blade kept his hand on the katana, but did not draw. The woman radiated danger in a way he recognized immediately, not the chaotic, feral danger of the lesser vampires he had spent decades putting down, but something refined, controlled, the danger of a predator who had spent centuries learning to look like something other than what she was. "I don't know what your kind is," Blade said, his voice flat and even in the cathedral's acoustic space. "But I know what you are." Selene tilted her head, a gesture that was almost human, almost curious. "Do you? Because what you are is something I have not encountered in 500 years of serving my bloodline. A vampire who walks in sunlight, who smells of vampire blood but radiates none of their vulnerabilities." Her eyes tracked him with the precision of someone cataloging every detail for future use. "You are either the most dangerous thing to walk into this city in centuries, or you are already dead and simply do not know it yet." "I've heard that before," Blade said, "usually right before the person saying it finds out which one it is." Something flickered across Selene's face, not quite a smile but the ghost of one. Recognition, perhaps, of a kindred ruthlessness. She shifted her weight, one hand drifting casually toward the pistol holstered at her hip, not drawing, but acknowledging the geometry of the moment. Two predators in a dark room, each measuring the other. "The soldiers I sent were meant to bring you in alive," she said. "You killed them instead. That tells me something useful about your temperament." She paused. "The Elder Council will have felt their deaths. Victor's successor, Alexander, will have dispatched a second team already, a larger one, and unlike my people, they will not be interested in conversation. Blade processed this quickly. A second team, a faction called the Elder Council, a hierarchy with enough political structure to have succession protocols. This was not a coven. This was a civilization. The realization settled into his bones with an uncomfortable weight, heavier than any vampire he had ever faced. "How many?" he asked. "Enough to make this cathedral a tomb." Cellini's expression hardened. "Which is why I am offering you something Alexander never would, a way out, a way to survive the next hour, and if you are intelligent enough to see the value of it, a way to understand what you have stumbled into." "And what have I stumbled into?" Cellini moved then, not toward him, but to a side door set into the cathedral's eastern wall, half hidden behind a tapestry so old the threads had begun to dissolve into the stone behind it. She opened it, and the smell that wafted through was immediate and unmistakable. Lichens, alive, close, and aware. The muscandiron scent he had detected in the alley, concentrated now into something almost overpowering. "A war," Cellini said simply. "One that has been burning for over 1,000 years. And you, Daywalker, whatever you are, have just become the most valuable piece on the board." She led him through a network of tunnels beneath the cathedral that spoke of centuries of use by things that did not want to be seen moving through daylight. The passages were carved from natural stone, reinforced in places with medieval masonry, and in others with technology that was jarringly modern: motion sensors, thermal dampeners, communication relays embedded in the walls with a precision that suggested military-grade engineering. Blade cataloged everything. Force of habit. Intelligence gathering was as fundamental to his survival as the katana. Cellini moved ahead of him with the easy confidence of someone who had walked these paths 10,000 times. She did not look back. Either she trusted him not to attack, which suggested she understood his nature better than she let on, or she simply did not consider him a threat worth monitoring from behind. Blade suspected it was neither. He suspected she was testing him, watching how he moved, how he responded to the environment, and whether he showed signs of the territorial aggression that characterized most vampires in enclosed spaces. He showed nothing. He was not most vampires. They emerged into a chamber that had been converted into something between a war room and a safe house. Maps covered one wall, not digital but physical, hand-drawn on paper that looked decades old, marked with colored pins and annotations in at least 4 languages. A long table dominated the center, covered in weapons, ammunition boxes, and several modified firearms that Blade recognized as silver-core designs. On another wall, a series of surveillance monitors displayed feeds from cameras positioned across what appeared to be a significant portion of the city. Rooftops, alleyways, the entrances to what looked like underground parking structures, and subway tunnels. 2 other vampires occupied the room. Both turned when Blade entered, and both reacted with the same micro-expression of shock before training smoothed it away. A man, older, grizzled, with scars that spoke of centuries of combat, and a younger woman whose eyes carried the particular intensity of someone who had recently lost something important and had not yet decided how to channel the grief. "Daywalker," the man said. "It was not a greeting. It was an identification. A threat assessment is completed in a single word." "Eric," Cellini said, her tone carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without repetition. "Stand down. He is with me." "For now," Eric replied, but he stepped back, one hand still resting on the pistol at his side. Cellini turned to Blade and gestured toward the map wall. "This is Budapest. Tonight it is the flashpoint of something that has been building for 3 years." She pointed to a cluster of red pins concentrated around a district on the eastern bank of the Danube. "Here, beneath the old industrial quarter, the lichens have been consolidating. Their numbers have grown exponentially. Something is driving them. A new leader, perhaps, or a new purpose. For 1,000 years, the war between my kind and theirs has been one of attrition. We hold, They attack, we respond, the cycle repeats. She tapped the map with one finger, her expression darkening. That cycle broke 6 months ago. The Lycans stopped attacking individual death dealer patrols. They started attacking infrastructure, safe houses, blood banks, communication relays. She turned to face him fully, and in the monitor light, her features carried an ancient weariness that no amount of vampiric beauty could entirely conceal. They are preparing for something large, she said, an assault on one of the Elder strongholds. And Alexander, the current Elder, has decided that the best response is not defense. She paused. It is you. Blade stared at her. Explain. Word of what happened in that alley has already reached the council. 3 death dealers killed by a single individual who walked through UV rounds without flinching. Seleni's voice carried a careful neutrality that did not quite mask the undercurrent of something darker. A vampire who cannot be burned by sunlight, cannot be killed by conventional means, and who clearly has no loyalty to any existing bloodline. Alexander sees a weapon, something he can point at the Lycans and unleash. I'm no one's weapon, Blade said. Seleni's expression did not change. That is precisely what makes you dangerous to him, and precisely why, if you do not choose a side before dawn, he will choose for you by force or by destroying you entirely. She held his gaze with the steady, ancient calm of someone who had watched 1,000 men believe they were untouchable. I am offering you the third option. Work with me, not for the vampires, not for the Lycans. For the truth about this war, because, Daywalker, I have spent 5 centuries fighting it, and I have only recently begun to understand that almost everything I was taught about it was a lie. The cathedral's silence pressed down around them. Outside, somewhere in the rain-soaked streets, the second team was already moving. Blade looked at the map, at the red pins, at the woman who had just told him that a 1,000-year war might be built on a foundation of deception. Then he looked at Selene, at the conviction in her eyes that could not be faked, not even by something 5 centuries old. Talk, he said. The Elder's name was Alexander, and he had not survived 3 centuries by underestimating threats. Selene had spent the better part of an hour talking, more than she had spoken to any single individual in decades, more than the political situation strictly required, and Blade had listened with the same cold, analytical attention he brought to every intelligence briefing he had ever conducted. The story she told was not simple. It was not the clean binary of good versus evil that had governed his entire existence. It was something messier, older, and far more dangerous than any coven he had ever dismantled. The war between vampires and Lycans, what Selene called the species war, had begun over 1,000 years ago, born from a single event that neither side fully remembered correctly. A vampire elder named Victor had discovered that the first Lycan, a creature named William, was the twin brother of his own daughter, Sonia. When Sonia chose William, chose love over bloodline loyalty, Victor had executed them both, or so the official history maintained. But Selene had spent the last 3 years uncovering evidence that the execution had been staged, that Victor had not simply killed his daughter and her lover. He had used their deaths to justify a war of extermination against the Lycans, a war that served the Elder Council's interests in maintaining absolute control over vampire society, far more than any genuine existential threat. The Lycans were never the aggressors, Selene said, her voice carrying the particular weight of someone who had built their entire identity on a foundation that had just crumbled. We were. From the very beginning, we were. Blade had sat with that revelation for a long time, turning it over in his mind the way he might examine a new weapon, testing its weight, its balance, its potential to cut. The irony was not lost on him. He had entered this universe expecting the familiar landscape, vampires as monsters, the mission as simple, the moral calculus as clean. Instead, he had found something that looked disturbingly like the political structures he had spent his career destroying in the Marvel universe. Ancient power structures that maintained their authority not through strength alone, but through the careful manipulation of history itself. Dawn was still 4 hours away when the summons came. It arrived not as a messenger or a phone call, but as a sensation, a sudden cold pressure against Blade's consciousness, like a hand pressing against the inside of his skull. He had felt psychic manipulation before. Vampires in his own universe had attempted it dozens of times. None had ever come close to penetrating his mental defenses. This was different. This was not an attempt to control or compel. It was simply an announcement. A statement of presence so ancient and so powerful that it bypassed his resistance not through force, but through sheer weight. The way a mountain did not need to move to make a man stop walking. Come to the Palazzo Nero. Come alone, come now. Blade did not move. He looked at Selene, who had gone very still, her face carrying an expression he had not seen on her before, something close to fear. "Alexander," she whispered. "He's in my head," Blade said. His tone was flat, but something cold had settled behind his eyes. No one got into his head. No one. "He can do that to anyone," Selene said. "The elders, the truly old ones, their psychic capabilities are." She stopped, choosing her words with care. "Immense. Alexander is the oldest vampire currently alive. He has consumed the memories of dozens of elders before him. His mind contains centuries of accumulated knowledge and power." She met Blade's gaze. "If he wanted to control you, he would not have sent an invitation. He would have simply made you walk there yourself." "Then why the courtesy?" Selene's expression darkened. "Because he wants you to come willingly. He wants you to choose to serve him." She stood, moving to the weapons table and checking a magazine with practiced efficiency. An unwilling weapon can be broken. A willing one can be trusted. Blade considered this for exactly 3 seconds. Then he stood, checked his own weapons, the katana, the modified beretta, 3 UV grenades, and a belt of silver rounds, and moved toward the chamber's exit. "Don't follow me," he said. "I wasn't planning to," Selene replied. But her eyes followed him until he disappeared into the tunnels, and in them was something that looked very much like a gambler watching a piece move on a board where the rules had just changed. The Palazzo Nero occupied the top 3 floors of a building that, from the outside, appeared to be a renovated aristocratic townhouse. Beautiful, historic, utterly unremarkable to anyone passing on the street below. From the inside, it was something else entirely. Blade felt the shift the moment he crossed the threshold. The air itself changed, thicker, colder, charged with a static energy that made the hair on his arms stand up despite the vampiric blood coursing through his veins. The walls were lined with artwork that spanned centuries, each piece depicting scenes of violence rendered in extraordinary detail. Battles, hunts, executions, a visual history of power exercised without restraint, displayed with the casual pride of someone who saw no reason to hide what they were. He was not escorted. No guards met him at the door, no servants directed him upward. The building simply opened for him, doors unlocking as he approached, corridors revealing themselves in sequence, as though the structure itself was alive and obedient. The psychic pressure in his skull remained constant but did not intensify. A leash, carefully maintained at a tension that communicated control without demanding compliance. The throne room, because that was what it was, regardless of what the room's original architectural purpose had been, occupied the entire top floor. The ceiling had been removed and replaced with a skylight of reinforced glass that looked directly up into the night sky, the stars visible through breaks in the clouds. Rain streaked the glass in irregular patterns. At the far end of the room, seated in a chair that was not quite a throne but carried all of a throne's implications, was Alexander. He was old, not in the way that humans showed age, vampires did not deteriorate, but in the way that ancient things carried weight simply by existing. His face was angular, aristocratic, beautiful in the particular way that predators were beautiful. His eyes were dark, almost black, and they tracked Blade's entrance with an attention that felt physical, like being touched by something very cold and very sharp. "Eric Brooks," Alexander said. His voice was low, unhurried, carrying the particular richness of someone who had not needed to raise his voice to command attention in centuries. "The Daywalker. I have been reading about your kind in my library. You are, it seems, an impossibility that refuses to stop existing." Blade said nothing. He stood in the center of the room, hands at his sides, and let the silence work. In his experience, powerful men filled the silence. They could not help it. The need to be heard, to assert dominance through speech, was one of the few traits that vampires and humans shared equally. Alexander smiled. It was a thin expression, patient, entirely without warmth. "You are not afraid of me," he observed. "Should I be?" "Beings who stand where you are standing are, yes." Alexander leaned forward slightly, and the movement carried the weight of something ancient shifting. "But you are not most beings. You are something the war has never produced, a vampire without allegiance, without a bloodline, without loyalty to anything except your own conviction." He tilted his head, studying Blade with genuine curiosity. "Tell me, in your world, wherever you came from, did you ever succeed? Did you ever end the vampires?" The question landed with unexpected precision. Blade held Alexander's gaze and answered honestly, because the truth served him better here than any lie could. "No," he said, "I didn't." Alexander nodded, as though this confirmed something he had already suspected. "Then perhaps," he said, rising from his chair with a fluid grace that spoke of centuries of practiced movement, "it is time you tried a different approach." He extended one hand, not offering a weapon or a document, but simply opening his palm. An invitation, a choice. "The Lycans are coming," Alexander said, "tonight, and I am offering you the one thing no one in this war has ever offered you, Daywalker." His dark eyes held Blade's with an almost magnetic intensity, a side worth fighting for. The Lycan assault began at 3 a.m., and it began with silence. Blade had not accepted Alexander's hand. He had not rejected it either. He had stood in that throne room for 11 minutes, an eternity by vampire political standards, and said nothing, while Alexander waited with the patience of someone who had conducted negotiations across centuries and understood that the most dangerous decisions were made in the spaces between words. What Blade had finally said was not an answer. It was a condition. "Show me what you're fighting for," he said. "Then I'll decide." Alexander had smiled again, that thin, patient expression that revealed nothing, and had given the order. Within 20 minutes, Blade found himself positioned on the rooftop of a reinforced death dealer stronghold on the eastern bank of the Danube, looking down at the industrial district where Cellini's maps had shown the Lycan consolidation. He was not alone. 40 death dealers occupied positions across 6 buildings, armed with UV-burst weapons, silver-core firearms, and devices Blade did not recognize. Compact, handheld units that hummed with a low frequency when activated, designed, he had been told, to disrupt Lycan healing factor temporarily. Vampire technology, refined over centuries specifically to counter one enemy. The rain had not stopped. It fell in sheets now, heavy and cold, turning the rooftops into shallow rivers and reducing visibility to perhaps 30 meters. Blade crouched at the building's edge, katana across his knees, and watched the darkness below with senses extended to their absolute maximum. The Lycan scent was everywhere, musk and iron and wild earth, concentrated so heavily in the air that it was almost a physical presence. Dozens of them, maybe more. Positioned in the shadows of the industrial buildings, with a discipline that did not match the feral image the vampire propaganda had painted. He had spent the last hour listening to Alexander's briefing, delivered through an earpiece by a tactical coordinator whose voice carried the clipped efficiency of someone who had run hundreds of these operations. The picture painted was straightforward. The Lycans had been growing bolder for months. Intelligence suggested they were preparing a coordinated strike on multiple vampire strongholds simultaneously, a strategy that had not been attempted in over 2 centuries. Alexander's response was elegant in its brutality. Strike first, hit the Lycan staging area before they could mobilize, and demonstrate that the Elder Council's reach extended into every shadow they occupied. Blade had listened. He had also noticed the things the briefing did not mention. The way the Death Dealers spoke about the Lycans, not with the focused hatred of soldiers facing an enemy, but with a particular kind of contempt, dismissal dressed as aggression. The way Alexander's tactical coordinator had referred to the Lycans' new leadership as aberrant behavior rather than strategic adaptation. The way no one, in an hour of detailed military planning, had once asked why the Lycans were attacking. It was the same pattern Blade had seen a dozen times before, in a dozen different contexts. An enemy reduced to a threat assessment, a war reduced to logistics, the human cost, or in this case, the living creature cost, rendered invisible by the machinery of institutional violence. The first Lycan broke cover at 3 a.m. It moved fast, faster than Blade had expected, faster than the Death Dealer briefings had suggested. A massive creature, easily 7 feet tall in its shifted form, all muscle and sinew and teeth, bounding across the rooftop of an adjacent building with a speed that spoke of evolutionary perfection. It was followed by another, then 3 more. Then the darkness itself seemed to move, dozens of shapes surging upward from the industrial district like water breaking through a dam. Contact, the tactical coordinator's voice crackled through Blade's earpiece. All units weapons free. The Death Dealers opened fire simultaneously. UV rounds and silver bullets tore through the rain in bright arcs, each one precise, each one aimed with the kind of accuracy that only centuries of practice could produce. The first wave of Lycans hit the kill zone, and several went down, silver rounds punching through shifted flesh with enough force to drop even these massive creatures. But they did not stay down. Within seconds, the wounds were knitting themselves shut, bone reforming, flesh regenerating with an almost obscene speed. The silver rounds had bought time, not death. Blade watched this exchange for exactly 4 seconds. Then he stood, sheathed the katana across his back, drew his modified Beretta, and dropped off the rooftop. He landed 3 stories down without breaking stride, vampiric legs absorbing the impact like shock absorbers, and immediately found himself in the middle of the combat zone. The street below was chaos. Death Dealers and Lycans colliding in brutal close-quarters fighting, the sound of gunfire and tearing flesh and snarling mixed with the constant drumming of rain. A Lycan lunged at him from the left, a creature in mid-shift, half human, half something ancient and terrible, and Blade put 2 silver rounds through its skull before it completed the motion. It dropped, did not get back up. He moved through the street like water through stone, fluid, purposeful, lethal. The katana came out again, singing through the rain as he cut through a Lycan that had pinned a Death Dealer to the ground. Then another, then a third. His movements were not the frenzied violence of someone caught in battle. They were surgical, precise. The efficiency of someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of killing vampires, adapted in real time to creatures that were different in form but identical in principle. Hunt, disable, destroy. But something was wrong. It took him 40 seconds to identify it, and when he did, the realization hit him with a force that had nothing to do with physical combat. The Lycans were not attacking randomly. They were not surging through the streets in the mindless, feral assault that every Death Dealer briefing had described. They were coordinating, moving in teams, protecting wounded members, pulling fallen fighters back from the kill zones. One group, 3 Lycans working in perfect synchronization, had carved a path not toward the vampire stronghold, but toward a specific building on the district's eastern edge. A rescue. They were not here to destroy. They were here to extract something. Blade stopped killing. He lowered the Beretta and stood in the rain, blood his own and others, running down his face in rivulets, and watched the Lycans fight. Watched them fight, not like monsters, like soldiers defending something they valued. A Death Dealer, Eric, the scarred veteran from Seleni's war room, appeared at his side, covered in blood and rain, his UV pistol smoking. "What are you doing?" Eric demanded. They're the enemy, kill them. Blade did not answer. He was watching a young lichen, barely shifted, barely adult, drag an injured companion behind a collapsed wall. The creature's hands were shaking, not from fear, from effort, from the desperate, instinctive need to protect something precious. Blade had seen that expression before, on human faces, on faces that had nothing to do with monsters or wars or ancient grudges. It was the expression of someone fighting for something worth dying for. "They're not here to destroy your stronghold," Blade said quietly. Eric stared at him. "What?" "They're here to rescue someone." Blade turned his gaze toward the building that the coordinated Lycan team was fighting toward. Through the rain and the chaos, he could just make out the structure, not industrial, not military. A detention facility, cells, holding cages. Alexander is holding something in that building, something the Lycans value enough to launch a full assault to retrieve. He looked at Eric, and his expression carried a weight that silenced the vampire's protest before it formed. "And no one in your chain of command thought to mention it." Eric opened his mouth, closed it, looked toward the building, and in his eyes Blade saw something crack, the first fracture in a certainty that had held for 500 years. The battle raged on around them, silver and blood and rain, and somewhere in the chaos, a shape moved on a rooftop above, watching Blade's hesitation with ancient, calculating eyes. Selene had been right. The war was nothing like either side claimed. The truth was kept in a basement. Not a dramatic underground chamber, not a vault carved from ancient stone, just a basement. Concrete floor, exposed pipes, fluorescent lighting that buzzed and flickered with the particular arrhythmia of a power source that had not been maintained in months. The building Alexander had chosen for his detention facility was unremarkable from the outside, a converted warehouse in the industrial district, indistinguishable from the dozen others surrounding it. That was the point. The Elder Council did not hide its power in monuments. It hid it in plainness, in the spaces no one thought to look. Blade reached the basement at 4 a.m., 45 minutes after the Lycan assault had begun, moving through corridors that carried the particular cold sterility of a place designed to contain living things without ever acknowledging their humanity. He had not come through the front. Eric, shaken, questioning, useful in his confusion, had provided the building's layout from Death Dealer tactical files without fully understanding why he was doing it. Loyalty to the mission had cracked something open in the scarred vampire's worldview, and in that crack, Blade had found an ally, not a willing one, not yet, but a functional one. The guards had been minimal. 2 death dealers at the basement entrance, both dispatched with quiet efficiency. UV grenades that Blade had taken from the tactical supplies, detonated at close range in the narrow corridor. The vampires had not even registered surprise before the light consumed them. It was, Blade reflected as he descended the final flight of stairs, a telling detail. Alexander had not expected anyone to reach this point. The Elder's arrogance was not the theatrical, performative kind that Blade had spent decades exploiting. It was the quiet, foundational arrogance of someone who had never genuinely been challenged. The basement opened into a long room divided by heavy steel partitions into individual cells. The lighting was harsh, designed to disorient. The air smelled of blood, old blood, accumulated over months, and something else. Something that made Blade's vampiric senses flare with an instinct he had spent his entire existence suppressing. Recognition. The scent of something like him. Not vampire, not human. Something in between. Something that existed in the same impossible space he occupied and had been suffering for it. There were 12 cells, 11 were empty. The 12th contained a woman. She was chained to the wall, not with conventional restraints, but with silver-laced bindings that glowed faintly with an embedded UV filament, designed to burn continuously against vampiric skin without ever quite killing. A torture mechanism. Slow, deliberate, intended to break rather than destroy. Her clothes were torn, her body covered in half-healed wounds that spoke of repeated feeding, not by vampires seeking sustenance, but by vampires seeking information. Her head hung forward, hair matted against her face, and for a moment Blade thought she was dead. Then she moved, a small involuntary twitch of her fingers, and Blade understood. She was a lichen, in human form, small, dark-haired, perhaps 30 years old in appearance, but unmistakably lichen. The muscandiron scent was faint, suppressed by the silver bindings and the weeks of torture, but it was there. And beneath it something else. Something that made the pieces Selene had been assembling click into sudden, brutal clarity. This was what the lichens had been fighting for. Not a stronghold, not a weapon, a person. Someone Alexander had captured and was using to extract information about the lichen resistance, and someone whose existence Blade was beginning to understand was far more significant than a single prisoner. He crossed the cell in 3 strides and examined the bindings. Silver-laced, UV filament reinforced, magnetically sealed to the wall, sophisticated, designed by someone who understood exactly how to keep a lichen alive and in agony without ever allowing them to shift. Blade had seen similar designs in Marvel's vampire hunting archives, adapted and modified, but fundamentally the same philosophy. Contain, interrogate, discard. He drew a UV grenade from his belt and used it not as a weapon but as a cutting tool, the concentrated light burning through the magnetic seal in 4 seconds. The bindings fell away. The woman did not move. Her breathing was shallow, irregular, and when Blade carefully turned her face toward him, her eyes, when they opened, were unfocused, distant, carrying the particular vacancy of someone who had been in sustained pain for weeks and had retreated somewhere inside themselves where the pain could not reach. "Can you walk?" Blade asked. She blinked, focused, and in the space of a single heartbeat, something shifted behind her eyes, something that was not quite human and not quite animal, but ancient and furious and aware. "Who are you?" Her voice was raw, barely functional, but the intelligence behind it was immediate and sharp. "Someone who doesn't work for Alexander," Blade said. "Can you walk?" She tested her limbs. Slowly, painfully, she pushed herself upright, one hand braced against the cell wall. The wounds on her body were already beginning to close, lichen healing factor reasserting itself now that the silver bindings were gone, knitting flesh with a speed that was impressive even by Blade's standards. She straightened to her full height, shorter than him, but carrying herself with a rigid dignity that spoke of someone who refused to be diminished regardless of what had been done to her. "My name is Katja," she said, "and I need to know something before I go anywhere with you." Her eyes, dark, ancient, carrying 5 centuries of war, locked onto his with an intensity that matched Alexander's. "What are you?" Blade held her gaze. Around them, the battle still raged above, the muffled sounds of gunfire and combat filtering through the concrete ceiling like distant thunder. Somewhere in the palazzo across the city, Alexander was watching the assault through surveillance feeds, tracking the movement of his death dealers, calculating the cost of the evening's operation. Somewhere on a rooftop, Selene was positioned with a rifle and a plan that depended on Blade making exactly this choice. "I'm a Daywalker," Blade said. "Half vampire. I kill vampires for a living." Katja stared at him for a long moment. Then, impossibly, she laughed, a short, broken sound that was more relief than humor. "Then you might be the only person in this city who can help me end this war," she said. They moved fast, Katja leaning on Blade for support as her healing factor worked overtime to repair the damage Alexander's interrogators had inflicted over weeks of captivity. She talked as they moved, not with the desperate gratitude of a rescued prisoner, but with the controlled, focused urgency of someone delivering a critical intelligence briefing under time pressure. The information she provided was devastating in its simplicity. Alexander knew the truth about the war's origins. He had known for decades. The story of Victor and Sonia, the founding myth that justified the Elder Council's authority over all vampire society, was not merely incomplete. It was fabricated. Victor had not executed Sonia and William in a fit of rage. He had orchestrated their deaths deliberately, manufacturing the grief that would unite the vampire bloodlines under Elder Council control and justify the extermination campaign against the Lycans. The war was not born from tragedy. It was born from politics. Katja had discovered this through the one thing Alexander could not control, the Lycan oral tradition. Stories passed down through generations, preserved not in written records that could be destroyed or altered, but in the memories of those who had survived. She had been, before her capture, the keeper of those stories, the repository of the Lycan version of history, and Alexander had spent weeks trying to extract from her the location of the archive where the physical evidence was stored. Proof. Documented, verifiable proof that the war's foundation was a lie. "He can't let that evidence reach the other elders," Katja said as they climbed the basement stairs. "If the bloodlines learn that the war was manufactured, that they have been fighting and dying for 1,000 years to serve one elder's political ambition, the council's authority collapses. Everything Alexander has built collapses with it." Blade processed this as they moved through the corridor toward the building's eastern exit. The implications were staggering, not just for the vampire-Lycan war, but for the fundamental structure of power in this universe. An ancient institution built on manufactured consent, a civilization sustained by a lie so old it had become indistinguishable from truth. He had seen versions of this before in governments, in criminal organizations, in the vampire courts of his own universe. But never on this scale, never with this much blood behind it. They emerged onto the street into rain and chaos. The battle had shifted. The Lycan assault team had breached the detention facility's perimeter on the northern side, drawing the Death Dealer defenders away from the eastern exit. Blade and Katja slipped through the gap like ghosts, moving through the shadows toward the rendezvous point Selene had designated hours earlier. And then Blade stopped. Because standing at the end of the alley, blocking their path with the casual authority of someone who had never once in his existence been denied passage, was Alexander. He was alone, no guards, no escort, just the elder standing in the rain with his dark coat soaked through and his ancient eyes fixed on the woman at Blade's side with an expression that carried no surprise whatsoever. "I see you found my guest," Alexander said. His voice was calm, conversational, the tone of a man discussing the weather. "I wondered how long it would take you to reach her." Blade shifted his weight, positioning himself between Alexander and Katja. The katana was in his hand. He did not remember drawing it. The silver rounds in his beretta would not stop Alexander, not permanently, not an elder this old, but they would buy time. "It's over, Alexander," Blade said. The elder smiled, that thin, patient expression, the same one he had worn in the throne room, the same one he had worn when he extended his hand. "Nothing," Alexander said, "is over until I decide it is." And in his hand, raised casually as though it weighed nothing, was a device Blade had not seen before, small, compact, pulsing with a light that was neither UV nor silver, but something older, something that carried the weight of centuries of vampiric science refined toward a single, terrible purpose. "But I will give you the choice," Alexander continued, "because I am, despite what your new friends have told you, not a monster." He tilted his head. "I am simply the one who understands what this war requires, and what it requires, Daywalker, is that some truths remain buried." The rain fell between them. The battle raged behind them, and somewhere in the distance, the first gray light of dawn began to bleed across the Budapest skyline, the one thing in this universe that had never belonged to either side of the war. Blade looked at Alexander, at the device in his hand, at Katja, wounded and resolute behind him, at the dawn approaching like a tide that could not be stopped. Then he made his choice. The katana moved, not toward Alexander, not yet, toward the device. A single, precise strike that shattered the Elder's weapon and sent its components scattering across the wet cobblestones in a spray of sparks and dying light. Alexander's eyes widened, the first genuine surprise Blade had seen on his face. And in that fraction of a second of lost composure, Blade closed the distance between them. He did not kill Alexander. He could have. The katana was at the Elder's throat before the vampire's centuries of combat instinct could fully engage, the blade pressing into ancient flesh with enough force to draw blood but not enough to end. Blade held him there pinned, and leaned close enough to speak without raising his voice above the rain. "The war ends," Blade said. "Not because you choose it, because the truth comes out. And you can either let that happen with dignity or I can make it happen without you." Alexander looked into Blade's eyes, into the face of something that had existed in the impossible space between vampire and human for decades, something that had never once compromised on the question of what monsters deserved. And for the first time in 3 centuries, the Elder Council's most powerful member understood that he was not the most dangerous thing in Budapest tonight. "You have no idea what you've unleashed," Alexander whispered. "Good," Blade said. He released the Elder and stepped back. Alexander did not attack. He straightened his coat, touched the thin line of blood at his throat where the katana had pressed, and looked at Blade with an expression that had shed its aristocratic mask entirely. Beneath it was something older, something that carried the weight of 1,000 years of carefully constructed lies, beginning, finally, to crack. Then Alexander turned and disappeared into the rain, moving with the fluid speed of something that had survived this long by knowing when a battle was lost. Katja watched him go. Then she looked at Blade, at the rain-soaked, blood-covered figure who had walked into a war 1,000 years old and in the space of a single night, begun to dismantle it from the inside. "The archive," she said. "The evidence, it's in Prague. Where did you come from?" Blade almost smiled, almost. The dimensional breach that had brought him here, the ritual gone wrong in that Prague basement, had deposited him in this universe. And the truth that could end the war had been waiting in the same city he had left behind. The universe, it seemed, had a sense of irony after all. Behind them, the first true light of dawn broke over Budapest. The rain did not stop. It never stopped in this city, but for the first time in hours, the sound of gunfire began to fade. The battle was not over. The war was not over. But the lie that had sustained it for 1,000 years had been seen, and named, and challenged by something neither side had ever accounted for. A daywalker, walking in the light that had never belonged to the darkness. And in the shadows of the aristocratic townhouse across the city, in a room where ancient artwork depicted centuries of violence rendered in exquisite detail, a shape moved on the rooftop. Selene lowered her rifle. She had not needed to fire a single round, and watched the dawn with eyes that carried 500 years of service to a cause she now knew had been built on ash. The truth would spread. It could not be stopped, not by Alexander, not by the Elder Council, not by anything except the slow, unstoppable weight of a lie finally exposed to light. But truth, in Blade's experience, was never the end of a story. It was always, always the beginning of the next one. And somewhere beyond Budapest, beyond this rain-soaked universe of ancient wars and aristocratic monsters, the dimensional breach that had brought him here had not closed. It pulsed, faintly, in a Prague basement no one was watching. A door left open, a path back to a world where the vampires he had spent his life hunting were still waiting. Or a path forward into whatever came next. Blade had not decided yet, but the dawn was rising, and for the first time since he had arrived in this universe, he was not fighting in the dark. Budapest did not change overnight. Wars that had burned for a millennium did not extinguish themselves because one night's lies had been exposed. The death dealers still patrolled. The lichens still moved through the shadows. Alexander disappeared into the Elder Council's network of safe houses, wounded but not destroyed, an animal backed into a corner and therefore more dangerous than ever. But the architecture of the war had shifted. Katja's testimony, combined with Seleni's 3 years of evidence, began to move through vampire society like a current through still water, quiet, invisible, but inexorable. The other elders were listening. Some did not want to hear what they were hearing. Others had suspected for decades and lacked only the proof to act. Blade stayed in Budapest for 3 days after the assault. He spent those days with Selene, not as allies exactly, but as two creatures who understood each other's particular brand of damage. She showed him the scope of what she had uncovered. He showed her what the war looked like from the outside, from the perspective of someone who owed nothing to either bloodline and therefore could see both with brutal clarity. On the 4th morning, he stood at the edge of the dimensional breach in Prague, the same basement where a ritual had shattered the boundaries between worlds. The portal pulsed with cold light. A way home. A way back to the familiar war, the familiar monsters, the familiar mission. Katja stood beside him, healed now, her ancient eyes carrying the particular fire of someone who had been given back something she thought was gone forever. Purpose. "The truth is out there," she said, "but someone needs to make sure it stays that way." Blade looked at the portal, then at the gray Prague sky above them, where the sun burned, indifferent, eternal, belonging to no one. He had spent his entire existence believing the monsters wore one face. Tonight, he had learned they wore many. The war was far from over, but for the first time it was being fought honestly. And that, in the end, was the only kind of war worth surviving. Hope shines brightest in the darkest night. More stories await.